What's the most unfair accusation your child ever faced from family? 2 summers ago, my entire family gathered at my parents' house for my mom's birthday. It was one of those big events where everyone shows up: siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, and kids running everywhere. The night was supposed to be joyful, but it turned into one of the worst experiences of my son's life. My mom had taken off her diamond bracelet before dinner and left it on her dresser in her bedroom. It was one of her prized possessions, a gift from my late grandmother, and worth thousands. A few hours later, she noticed it was missing. Before anyone even looked for it, my brother loudly declared that he knew who had taken it: my 14-year-old son. I walked into the living room to find my brother towering over my boy, demanding that he admit what he did. My son looked terrified, his cheeks blotchy from holding back tears. My brother insisted that he'd seen my son lingering in the hallway near Mom's bedroom earlier. That was his only evidence. The rest of my family fell silent, watching as my son was grilled like a criminal. My mom asked gently if he'd seen her bracelet. My son shook his head furiously and whispered that he hadn't. My brother, however, wasn't satisfied. He told my son to empty his pockets right there in front of everyone. My son, with trembling hands, did as he was told. His jeans pockets were empty. Then they searched his backpack, then his jacket. Nothing. Still, my brother sneered and said he must have hidden it somewhere else. The whispers started. Some family members exchanged uneasy looks, but nobody stepped in to defend my son. I could see the shame written all over his face as tears started to spill. Finally, I had enough. I told everyone we were leaving. My brother shouted after us that running away just makes him look guilty. That was the moment my son broke down in sobs. On the drive home, he begged me to believe him. My heart shattered when he asked, "Did they all think I'm a thief now?" I told him I believed him completely. I barely slept that night. Rage turned in me. My child had been humiliated in front of the entire family, accused without evidence, and branded guilty without question. Something felt wrong, too wrong. The next morning, I went back to my parents' house. Most of the family was still asleep, but I found my dad in the kitchen. I asked him if he'd checked the new security cameras they'd installed after a break-in scare. At first, he hesitated and said my brother thought it wasn't necessary. That was all the confirmation I needed. I pushed. Finally, my dad pulled up the footage from the night before. My stomach turned as I watched. Around 9 p.m., the cameras showed my brother entering my mom's room alone. He opened her jewelry box, glanced around, and slipped the bracelet straight into his pocket. He never put it back. I felt a mix of fury and grim satisfaction. My son had been telling the truth, and now I had undeniable proof. I told my dad not to wake anyone yet. I wanted every single family member to see this together. When everyone gathered in the living room, I announced we needed to clear something up. My brother crossed his arms, smirking like he was waiting for me to apologize for defending my son. Instead, I connected the footage to the TV and pressed play. The room went dead silent. There was my brother, caught red-handed. My mom gasped, covering her mouth. My son, standing behind me, watched wide-eyed as the truth finally came out. My brother's face drained of color. He tried to mumble that he'd just been moving it to keep it safe. My lawyer friend later told me that the excuse wouldn't have held up in court. It was attempted theft, plain and simple. My mom demanded the bracelet back immediately. My brother disappeared into his room, and when he returned, he said, "It's gone." My mom's hands flew to her mouth and tears started rolling down her face. She kept asking where it was, where her mother's bracelet had gone, her voice getting higher with each word. My brother just stood there shrugging his shoulders and mumbling something about bills and needing money fast. The whole room felt like it was about to explode with everyone holding their breath. My aunt started crying too and my dad's face turned red like it does when he's really mad. I grabbed my son's hand tight and pulled him toward the door. We were leaving right now and I didn't care what anyone thought about it. My son was shaking next to me and I could feel how scared and confused he still was. Several people tried to say something but I gave them the coldest look I could manage. My cousin reached out like she wanted to stop us but I pushed past her. Nobody had defended my son when he needed them and now they wanted to talk. The front door slammed behind us so hard the windows rattled. My son practically ran to the car and jumped in the passenger seat. His hands were shaking so bad he couldn't buckle his seatbelt at first. I started the engine and peeled out of the driveway faster than I should have. We made it about 3 blocks before my son completely lost it. He was sobbing so hard his whole body shook and he kept asking the same question over and over. Would everyone always think he was a thief even though we proved he didn't do it? I pulled over into a parking lot because I couldn't see through my own tears anymore. I turned off the car and pulled him into the biggest hug I could manage across the center console. He kept saying they all watched his uncle yell at him and nobody helped. I held him while he cried and told him the truth was out now and that's what mattered. But he was right that they had all stood there and watched him get attacked. I didn't have any good answer for why they did that. We sat there for probably 20 minutes until we both stopped crying enough to drive home. The rest of the ride was quiet except for his sniffles every few minutes. When we got home he went straight to his room and closed the door. I heard him crying again through the walls but figured he needed some space. That night I couldn't sleep at all and just laid there staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes I saw their faces from earlier. The way my aunt looked away when my brother was yelling at my son. How my other cousins seemed uncomfortable but didn't say anything to stop it. The way some of them actually looked like they believed my brother's lies about my son. The anger burned so hot in my chest I thought I might throw up. I got up and paced around the house trying to calm down. I made lists in my head of who did what and who stayed silent. By morning I hadn't slept a single minute and felt like a zombie. I made my son breakfast and told him I needed to go back to talk to his grandparents. He looked scared and asked if I was going to yell at them. I promised I would stay calm, but we needed to figure out what happened with the bracelet. He nodded and went back to his room with his plate. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual even though it's only 15 minutes. Dad opened the door before I could knock and he looked exhausted. His hair was sticking up and he had bags under his eyes like he hadn't slept either. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table in her bathrobe looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying and she barely looked up when I walked in. We all sat down at the kitchen table and nobody wanted to talk first. I asked them directly what they planned to do about my brother stealing from Mom. Dad kept rubbing his face with both hands like he was trying to wake up. Mom just stared at her coffee cup and wouldn't look at either of us. Finally she whispered that she just wanted her bracelet back but her voice cracked. We all knew that was probably impossible now if my brother had already sold it. I told them my son deserved a public apology from my brother in front of everyone. Mom nodded right away but Dad started making excuses about money troubles. I slammed my hand on the table harder than I meant to and the coffee cups jumped. I reminded them that being broke doesn't make it okay to destroy a kid's reputation. Dad looked ashamed and stopped talking, but I could tell he still wanted to defend my brother. When I got home I found my son sitting on his bed staring at his phone. He showed me a text from his cousin asking if he really stole the bracelet. The cousin said their parents were talking about the whole situation and weren't sure what to believe. My son had fresh tears running down his face and asked why people still thought he did it. I took his phone and blocked the cousin's number right there in front of him. I told him we were only keeping people in our lives who believed him completely. He nodded but I could see how much it hurt him to lose his cousin like that. That afternoon I called Mallory Fox who I'd known since college and who worked as a lawyer now. She listened while I explained everything that had happened with the bracelet and the video proof. She said we could definitely file a police report for theft even if the bracelet was gone. She explained that the court could order my brother to pay restitution for the value. She also said what he did to my son could be defamation or emotional distress. She told me to document everything and save any texts or messages about the situation. After hanging up I checked our family group chat and immediately wished I hadn't. People were taking sides with some saying we should handle this privately as a family. Others stayed completely silent which felt just as bad as taking my brother's side. One aunt wrote that kids make mistakes and we should show forgiveness. That made me so mad because my son didn't make any mistake at all. I typed and deleted probably 12 different angry responses before deciding to stay quiet. Instead I took screenshots of everything for the folder I was making for Mallory. That evening around 7 my phone rang and Mom's name showed up on the screen. I picked up and heard her crying harder than I'd heard in years. She kept saying the bracelet was the last thing her mother gave her before she died from cancer 3 years ago. Her voice cracked when she said finding out my brother took it hurt worse than losing the bracelet itself. She told me she'd been noticing things going missing for years, but always made excuses for him. I listened while she cried and admitted she knew he had problems with gambling, but never wanted to face it. She asked me how my son was doing and I told her he was in his room and hadn't come out for dinner. After we hung up I went to check on him and found him under his covers with his phone. The next morning he came into the kitchen looking pale and showed me his phone screen. One of our cousins had posted something on Instagram about family drama and theft at Grandma's birthday party. The comments were already filling up with people asking what happened. My son's hand shook as he scrolled through messages from kids at the school asking if the post was about him. He begged me to let him stay home but I knew that would make the rumors worse. We sat at the kitchen table and I promised I'd come get him if things got too bad at the school. He nodded but I could see he felt sick about going. After he left for the bus I spent the morning organizing everything into a digital folder on my laptop. I took screenshots of every text in the family chat where people were taking sides or staying silent. I saved the security footage Dad had sent me showing my brother taking the bracelet. I wrote out a timeline starting from when Mom noticed the bracelet missing to when we watched the footage together. I put everything in a folder labeled evidence and emailed it to Mallory with a note asking her to keep copies safe. She replied within 10 minutes saying this documentation was exactly what we'd need if we decided to take legal action. Around noon my phone buzzed with a text from my son at the school. His friend had cornered him at his locker asking what happened at the family party because he heard my son got in trouble for stealing. My son wrote that he lied and said nothing happened, but he felt awful about it. I texted back that he didn't owe anyone explanations and protecting himself wasn't the same as lying. He sent back a thumbs up but I could tell he was struggling. That afternoon after he got on the bus home I called Dad to ask why he'd hesitated when I first asked about the security cameras. He got defensive right away and said he hadn't wanted to make things worse between family members. I pushed harder and asked if he suspected my brother might have taken it. There was a long pause before he admitted he'd wondered about it. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the stomach. He let my son get accused and humiliated while suspecting the real thief all along. I hung up without saying goodbye because I couldn't trust what might come out of my mouth. When my son got home from the school he looked completely drained. He dropped his backpack by the door and told me he'd spent lunch hiding in the bathroom because he couldn't face the cafeteria. Kids were whispering and pointing at him all day. He said someone told him his uncle had posted online about a family incident involving theft. Everyone was making assumptions about what happened. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and asked if we could switch schools. My heart broke watching him suffer for something he didn't do. That evening after dinner I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and started writing down every valuable thing that had gone missing at family gatherings over the years. Dad's watch at Christmas 2 years ago that we thought got misplaced. Cash from Mom's purse during Easter dinner. My cousin's iPad that disappeared during Thanksgiving. Small electronics during the 4th of July barbecue. The pattern was obvious now that I was looking for it. I took a picture of the list and texted it to Mom. She called immediately and her voice shook as she went through each item on the list. She remembered every incident and realized my brother had been there for all of them. She started crying again as the truth of how long this had been going on hit her. The next morning my phone rang early and Mallory's name showed up. She explained that if we filed a police report it could mean my brother would face jail time for theft. The family would definitely split apart over criminal charges. She said we could also file a civil lawsuit for damages including what my son went through. She suggested starting with a formal demand letter asking for the bracelet back or its value plus a written apology to my son. She said this would give my brother a chance to make things right without involving police yet. My son must have heard me talking because after I hung up he came into the kitchen and asked if his uncle might go to jail because of him. I sat him down at the table and looked him in the eyes. I explained that nothing happening was because of him and everything was because his uncle stole and then blamed him for it. He nodded but I could see guilt in his eyes that shouldn't be there. I pulled up my laptop and started searching for therapists who could help kids deal with trauma and false accusations. I found Lena Weiss who had great reviews and specialized in helping young people process these kinds of experiences. When I told my son I was making him an appointment he shook his head and said talking to someone wouldn't change what happened. I explained it might help with the anxiety and sick feeling he'd been carrying around. He finally agreed but made me promise I wouldn't leave him alone at the appointment. That evening Mom called while I was washing dishes and her voice sounded different, broken in a way I'd never heard before. She told me she'd been going through her jewelry box and realized her anniversary earrings were gone too, the ones Dad gave her for their 25th. Then she mentioned Dad's watch that went missing at Christmas and the cash that vanished from her purse during last year's holiday dinner. She kept listing things and each one made her voice crack more until she was sobbing about how she'd been making excuses for my brother for years. I stood there with soap suds dripping off my hands listening to her finally see the pattern she'd been ignoring. After we hung up I found my son at the kitchen table with the journal Lena suggested, writing furiously with his head bent low over the page. When he heard me come in he tried to cover it but I saw enough to read the words "Why did you pick me to blame" at the top. He'd written a whole letter to his uncle asking why he'd thrown him under the bus and what he'd done to deserve being the scapegoat. The words were angry but also hurt, asking if his uncle ever even liked him or if he'd always just been an easy target. My son looked up at me with tears in his eyes then grabbed the paper and tore it into tiny pieces, stuffing them in the trash and saying it didn't matter because his uncle wouldn't care anyway. The next morning I drove to my parents' house while my son was at the school because I needed to look for more evidence of my brother's pattern. Mom was at her book club so I let myself in with my key and went straight to the old answering machine they still kept on the kitchen counter. I scrolled through saved messages looking for anything useful when I found one from 3 days before Mom's birthday party. A debt collector's voice filled the kitchen asking for my brother by his full name and mentioning a significant outstanding balance that needed immediate attention. My hands shook as I played it again and recorded it on my phone before forwarding the audio file to Mallory with a note about what I'd found. 2 days later my phone rang during my lunch break and it was the school nurse saying my son was having a panic attack. She said a classmate had shown him something on their phone and he'd started hyperventilating so badly he couldn't catch his breath. I dropped everything and drove to the school with my heart pounding, finding him in the nurse's office with his head between his knees still shaking. The nurse was kind, but mentioned this was the 3rd time this week she'd seen him, which made my stomach drop because he hadn't told me about the other times. On the drive home he finally showed me what triggered it, a social media post from one of our cousins that said some people will steal from their own grandmother and let kids take the blame with a bunch of people commenting trying to figure out what happened. My son kept saying everyone at the school thought he was a thief now and nothing we did would change that. That afternoon Mallory called after reviewing the debt collector voicemail and said it established clear motive for the theft. She'd already drafted a formal demand letter requiring my brother to return the bracelet or pay $5,000 in restitution plus provide a written apology to my son. She explained we'd give him 1 week to respond before considering filing criminal charges or a civil lawsuit. I authorized her to send it immediately, feeling both relieved to take action and sick about how far this had gone. 3 days later was my son's first appointment with Lena and I kept my promise to stay in the waiting room the whole time. He went in looking terrified but came out 45 minutes later with his shoulders less hunched and something lighter in his eyes. He told me Lena taught him a grounding technique for panic attacks where he counts 5 things he can see, 4 he can hear, 3 he can touch, 2 he can smell and 1 he can taste. She validated that his response to being falsely accused was completely normal and that none of this was his fault. He said she told him adults who lie to cover their crimes are the only ones responsible for the damage they cause. She wanted to see him weekly and he actually agreed without me having to convince him. The next morning at the school he texted me around 10 saying kids were whispering in the hallway again but he'd used the grounding technique Lena taught him. He counted 5 lockers he could see and 4 different conversations he could hear and it helped him not run to the bathroom like he wanted to. He said he still felt sick to his stomach, but he'd stayed in class the whole period which felt like a victory. That afternoon I decided to try something else and started visiting pawn shops within driving distance of my parents' house. I showed each one a photo of Mom's bracelet from the insurance paperwork, explaining it might have been pawned recently. The first 4 shops said they couldn't help without a police report but I kept trying anyway. The 5th shop was different because when I described my brother the manager, a woman named Lacey, got this look of recognition on her face. She told me a man matching his description had come in 4 days ago trying to pawn jewelry but she couldn't say more without proper documentation. She explained their policy required ID for all transactions and they held items for 30 days in case they turned out to be stolen. Without confirming what he'd pawned, she suggested I act quickly because the hold period was already counting down and after 30 days items could be sold. My stomach dropped realizing we might actually be able to get Mom's bracelet back if we moved fast enough. I called my parents from the parking lot and Dad answered sounding tired. When I told him about the pawn shop and needing to file a police report immediately, he started protesting that it would destroy my brother and tear the family apart. Mom got on the phone and I could hear her struggling between wanting her mother's bracelet back and not wanting her son to have a criminal record. I reminded them both that the family was already torn apart and my son was the one suffering while my brother faced no consequences for stealing and lying. That night after dinner, my son came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed with his hands twisted together in his lap. He told me he was scared about what would happen if we called the police, but then admitted he'd feel safer if someone outside the family handled this whole mess. His voice cracked when he said he didn't trust family gatherings anymore and asked if we could skip Thanksgiving this year. I pulled him close and promised we'd do whatever made him feel safe, no matter what anyone else thought. The next morning I called Mallory to understand our options better before making any big decisions. She explained that filing a police report didn't automatically mean my brother would get prosecuted, since the police would just help recover the bracelet and then the district attorney would decide whether to actually press charges. She said restitution without jail time was possible, especially for first-time offenders, though she doubted this was really his first time stealing based on the pattern we discovered. We could also pursue a civil case separately for the emotional damage to my son if we wanted. I spent the whole morning going back and forth in my head about whether to file the report, pacing around my kitchen and drinking too much coffee. My hands shook as I gathered all the evidence into a folder: the security footage on a USB drive, the screenshots of the debt collector voicemail, photos of Mom's bracelet from the insurance paperwork. Finally I grabbed my keys and drove to the police station before I could change my mind. The officer at the front desk took me seriously right away when I showed him the security footage on my phone. He had me fill out forms and gave me a case number, saying a detective would follow up within 48 hours about the pawn shop lead. Walking out of the station felt surreal, like I'd crossed some invisible line I couldn't uncross. When I got home and told my son I'd filed the report, his whole body seemed to relax for the first time in days. He said maybe now people would have to believe the truth since it wasn't just family drama anymore. But then his face got worried again and he asked what would happen with family relationships now. I held him tight and admitted I didn't know what would happen next, but we'd face it together no matter what. 2 days later the detective called to say he'd contacted Lacey at the pawn shop and she confirmed she had a diamond bracelet matching our description in holding from my brother. She could legally hold it for evidence now that the police were involved, which meant we might actually get Mom's bracelet back. I felt a spark of hope for the first time since this whole nightmare started. Within an hour of the detective's call, my phone started buzzing with angry texts from my brother saying I was destroying the family by involving the police and that Mom would never forgive me. He claimed I was overreacting and that my son needed to toughen up instead of playing victim. I took screenshots of every single message and forwarded them to Mallory before blocking his number completely. My son saw me blocking his uncle's number on my phone and asked if he could do the same on his. We sat together on the couch and went through his contacts and he blocked not just his uncle but also the cousins who'd been spreading rumors at the school. He said it felt good to have some control over who could reach him for once. The next morning the school counselor Leona Schmidt called and asked me to come in for a meeting about managing the social fallout my son was experiencing. She'd already noticed his anxiety in the hallways and offered to check in with him daily, plus she'd speak to his teachers about being aware of potential bullying. Having someone at the school who understood the situation and wanted to help felt like a huge weight off my shoulders. That evening my parents came over and Dad finally admitted something that made everything make more sense. He'd been covering for my brother's gambling debts for years, which explained why he'd hesitated about checking the cameras in the first place. He'd been enabling him all this time, hoping he'd change, but realized now he'd just made everything worse by protecting him from consequences. Mom looked at him like she was seeing a stranger, her face pale and shocked. Later that night my son showed me his journal where he'd been writing about everything that happened. He'd written that he was angry at Grandpa for choosing keeping the peace over protecting him from false accusations. He asked if it was okay to be mad at Grandpa too, not just his uncle. I told him every single feeling he had about this was valid and he didn't have to forgive anyone until he was ready, if he ever was. The next morning my phone rang while I was making breakfast and the detective's voice sounded urgent when he told me we only had 30 days to claim the bracelet from the pawn shop. He explained that even with the police report, the shop had strict procedures about proving ownership before they could release anything. My hands started shaking as I wrote down everything he said about needing photos or receipts or insurance paperwork. I called Mom right away and she agreed to meet me at her house to search for proof. When I got there she was already pulling boxes from the hall closet, her hands trembling as she sorted through old photo albums. We spent 2 hours going through everything, finding pictures from holidays and birthdays where she wore the bracelet. Then she remembered the insurance paperwork in Dad's filing cabinet and we dug through folders until we found an old appraisal from 10 years ago. She held up a photo from her mother's 80th birthday party where the bracelet sparkled on her wrist. Tears started rolling down her face as she admitted she'd been pretending my brother wasn't as bad as he really was for years. She said she knew about his problems but kept hoping he'd change if she just loved him enough. I held her while she cried, both of us sitting on the floor surrounded by scattered photos and memories. Later that afternoon my son came home from his therapy appointment with Lena looking thoughtful. He sat at the kitchen table and told me he'd been talking about imagining holidays without his uncle there. He said it made him sad but also relieved at the same time. Lena had helped him understand that missing the uncle he thought he had was normal even while being angry at who his uncle really was. He looked at me and said it was okay to have complicated feelings about people who hurt you. 3 days later the detective called with news that made my stomach drop. The pawn shop's computer system had an error and they'd already released the bracelet for sale before the hold expired. Lacey was apologetic when she called to confirm, explaining that once something was sold to a customer they couldn't force its return without a court order. The bracelet was gone, just like that, sold to some stranger who had no idea what it meant to our family. I sat in my car in the parking lot and cried, knowing I'd have to tell Mom her mother's last gift was really gone forever. When I told Mom about the bracelet being sold, she seemed to shrink into herself. The insurance company would cover $3,000 of its $5,000 value but she just shook her head. She said the money didn't matter when it was the last thing her mother gave her before she died. We sat together on her couch in silence, both of us grieving different losses but feeling the same emptiness. A week later, Lena called with a suggestion that surprised me. She offered to facilitate a mediated family meeting to establish boundaries going forward, especially around protecting my son's well-being. My parents agreed right away, and after some back and forth, my brother said he'd attend rather than face potential criminal charges. We scheduled it for the following week, even though I had zero hope it would actually help anything. The mediation room at Lena's office felt too small when we all filed in. My brother slouched in his chair while my parents sat stiffly across from us. My son pressed close to my side, his whole body tense as Lena explained the ground rules about respectful communication. My brother started talking right away, admitting he took the bracelet because of gambling debts but insisting he never meant for my son to get blamed. He claimed he panicked when Mom noticed it missing and just said the first thing that came to mind. Lena interrupted him to point out that he deliberately chose to blame a child instead of confessing his own crime. She asked him to think about what that choice said about his priorities and values. Mom's voice shook when she directly demanded that my brother apologize to his nephew for the false accusation and public humiliation. My brother mumbled a quick sorry without even looking at my son. My son sat rigid beside me, barely breathing as he whispered okay just to make the interaction stop. The apology was completely worthless, but at least it was on record that my brother admitted what he'd done. I stated clearly that my brother wasn't welcome at any event where my son would be present. I told my parents that if they wanted to see us, it would have to be without him there. My parents looked hurt but nodded their understanding while my brother stood up and stormed out calling me dramatic. Lena made a note about his inability to take accountability even when confronted with the harm he'd caused. 2 days after the mediation, someone from the district attorney's office called about the theft charges. They explained they could pursue criminal prosecution but recommended a diversion program instead for first-time offenders. My brother would need to complete 100 hours of community service and pay $3,000 in restitution. The woman on the phone said Mom had a week to decide whether to support prosecution or the diversion program. Mom spent that week going back and forth, torn between wanting justice and not wanting her son to have a criminal record. The next morning my son came home from the school with something different in his eyes, not the usual tired defeat I'd been seeing for weeks. He told me this kid from his math class had walked up to him at his locker and said he was sorry for spreading the rumor without knowing what really happened. My son's voice got a little stronger when he explained how the kid had seen all the social media posts about the theft, but then heard the real story from another cousin who knew the truth. The apology was quick and awkward, but my son said it felt good to have someone admit they were wrong, and I noticed his shoulders weren't as hunched when he walked to his room that afternoon. My phone started buzzing nonstop with notifications from the family group chat where my aunt had posted that we all needed to forgive and forget for the sake of family unity. Other relatives jumped in saying my brother deserved another chance, while a few cousins backed us up saying what he did was unforgivable. I watched the messages pile up for an hour before typing out that my son's well-being would always come first and anyone who couldn't respect our boundaries wouldn't be welcome in our lives. 3 dots appeared and disappeared as people typed and deleted responses. Then 5 relatives left the chat, including 2 aunts who'd been at the birthday party. Mallory called that evening to go over our options one more time, explaining that even if the court ordered restitution, we'd probably never see the actual bracelet again since it had already been sold. She mentioned we could file a civil suit for emotional distress damages on top of a criminal case, but warned it would drag on for months and might not be worth the stress. We sat at my kitchen table looking at all the paperwork, and I decided we needed to focus on healing instead of getting stuck in endless legal battles that would keep the wound fresh. 2 days later at his therapy appointment, my son sat across from Lena practicing what to say when people asked about the family drama. She had him repeat phrases like "I don't discuss family matters" and "that situation has been handled" over and over until his voice stopped shaking. He practiced looking people in the eye while saying the words, and Lena praised him for how much stronger he was getting at setting boundaries. Mom finally called on the last day of her decision window to tell me she'd chosen to support the diversion program instead of pushing for jail time. She said she wanted my brother to get help for his gambling problem more than she wanted to see him behind bars. The program would make him pay $3,000 in restitution, do 100 hours picking up trash on the highway, and go to weekly gambling addiction meetings for 6 months. Nobody was thrilled with the compromise, but at least it was something, and Mom's voice sounded steadier than it had in weeks when she explained her reasoning. The following week Dad called to tell me my brother had moved in with some friend from high school after Dad told him he needed to start taking responsibility for his own life. It had taken Mom packing a suitcase and threatening to stay at her sister's house before Dad finally grew a backbone and set that boundary. When I stopped by to drop off some cookies for Mom, they both looked worn down and older, but they were sitting closer together on the couch than I'd seen in years. Dad admitted he should have stopped covering for my brother's problems a long time ago, and Mom squeezed his hand while he talked. 6 weeks after that nightmare birthday party, my son and I spent Saturday morning making chocolate chip pancakes and arguing about whether to watch the superhero movie or the comedy. We ended up watching both, sprawled on the couch with too many snacks, and neither of us mentioned the bracelet or family drama even once. Halfway through the second movie he laughed at something ridiculous the main character did, a real belly laugh that made him snort, and I realized it was the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him since before the party. These small normal moments felt huge after everything we'd been through, like tiny victories worth celebrating even if nobody else would understand why watching my kid laugh at a dumb joke meant so much. Looking back at everything that happened, I know the ending wasn't what any of us wanted, with the bracelet gone forever and that pathetic excuse for an apology from my brother. Some family relationships got broken beyond repair, and we'll probably never have another big gathering like we used to. But my son learned I'll always have his back no matter what, and we both figured out how to cut toxic people out of our lives even when they share our blood. Sometimes protecting your kid means accepting that messy, incomplete justice is better than no justice at all, and knowing when to walk away instead of fighting battles that will only hurt you more.